Hi, everybody. Welcome and greetings to you. Greetings to you all. It's so nice to see the shining faces of everybody on screen, off screen. We feel your presence. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Riley Love, and I am Dr. Badruddoja's intergenerational family trauma liberation apprentice. We're very excited to have you here today. Before we start, I just want to offer a little bit up about myself. I'm a fiery Aquarius, and I am a graduate of Manhattan College, where I studied history and peace and justice studies. I studied under Dr. Badruddoja for 4 years at Manhattan College. So I'm so excited to be back with her today, helping present her complimentary masterclass, The Lords of the Akashas, Healing Inherited Trauma and Recovering Liberation. So before I hand this over to the expert herself, I just want to go over a few quick Zoom guidelines for today. So please, everybody, keep your microphones muted just to avoid echoes and to avoid, the noise. We want everybody to feel comfortable to ask questions in the chat. Everything will be answered at the end during our Q&A session. So you are free to come off the mic at the end and ask your question or ask your questions in the chat box. So today we have Dr. Roxana Badruddoja. I am so excited to introduce her. Her is an academic leader, mystical healer, and overall badass. Dr. Roxana Badruddoja uses the pronouns her. Her is a feminine, masculine woman of color, an interfaith and cross-cultural womanist, a BIPOC liberation scholar, an intergenerational family trauma liberation therapist, an urban shamanic and Akashic practitioner, a tenured professor of sociology, women and gender studies, and critical race and ethnicity studies, and the chair of the Department of Sociology at Manhattan College, a PWI located in the Bronx, New York. Dr. Roxana Badruddoja is also a queer mother to 4 fierce energy beings. Her primary research areas include assemblage theory, intersectional and decolonial feminisms, South Asian American studies, critical race theory, violence against Black and Indigenous women of color, nationalism, citizenship and immigration, mother studies and reproductive trauma, womanist and decolonial ethnographies, and autohistoria teoria, and BIPOC traumas and life-affirming epistemology and grief. Dr. Rock Bad, as I lovingly call her, focuses on contemporary social inequalities and the voices of marginalized others as her sites of thinking to address social problems in the modern world. Her explores the meanings of spaces and places in the context of power, privilege and abuse and solidarity, resistance and mobilization. And her thinks deeply every day about how vulnerability is imagined, the practices of solidarity, and what it means to be of service to the marginalized. So, without further ado, I would love to introduce Dr. Roxana Badruddoja. Thank you.
Thank you for that expansive introduction, Riley Love. I'm deeply, deeply appreciative. Hi, y'all. I'm Dr. Roxana Badruddoja. Thank you for choosing to hang out with me this Saturday morning. I am deeply humbled by this. So if you're joining us today without a registration, then please drop your email into the chat box to Riley Love directly, please. We would really, really appreciate that. So greetings from New York, right? The land of Muncie, Lenape, and Wappinger. And I'd love to hear where you all are hailing from in the chat box. And if you know the indigenous or ancestral name of the land you're occupying, then please include that too. I'd love to see where you all are sitting. And you can just type in your responses in the chat box. Brooklyn, Las Vegas. Yeah, and if you know the ancestral name, the indigenous name of the land you're occupying, I would totally love to see that. Tanzania, Gujarat, Tampa, Harlem, Connecticut. Okay. Ohio, all right. Nepal, Dubai. Okay. All right. Okay, well, continue continue typing as you're joining in. So I'd like to start off with this, since I've asked you to think about the space that you're occupying. So in the context of epistemic violence towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color, it becomes really important to honor that we learn, teach, and live on pirated land. And what I mean by BIPOC epistemic violence is that our knowledge systems and cultures are being annihilated and then stolen and assimilated via cultural appropriation in the larger nation state. And so, underscoring BIPOC desecration, I squarely am asking all of us to acknowledge our roles in the histories of dispossession. And I recognize that my own academic institution is implicated in looting the land of Munsee Lenape and Wappinger, and that the language spoken on this land that I'm sitting on and that my academic institution is sitting on, the language spoken on this land is Munsee, contrary to the English-only, jingoistic discourse in the US. And so as part of the time that we spend together, and we're going to be spending about like 90 minutes together, I am asking you, I'm inviting you to think about and to sit in your own responsibility to your ancestral connections. And I want to repeat this, right? I'm inviting you to sit in your own responsibility to your ancestral connections. And of course, I'm not asking you to think about particularly an answer, but just to sit in this, right? Just to sit in what your responsibility is to your ancestral connections. Just sit in that energy. And that's going to be the focus of my upcoming 4-day Healing Inherited Trauma course in June, which is entitled The Lords of the Akashas, Healing Inherited Trauma and Recovering Liberation. So once again, my name is Dr. Roxana Badruddoja. My students and clients often refer to me as either Dr. Rock Bad or Dr. B. And I welcome you today to today's master class about how we may want to think about trauma, how we may want to think about healing, and how we may want to think about working with divine knowledge and spirit. So I'm an intergenerational family trauma liberation scholar and therapist. I'm an Akashic and shamanic practitioner in the traditions of the Indian subcontinent and the Andes. I'm a professor and the chair of the sociology department at Manhattan College, which is a PWI, which is a predominantly white institution located in the Bronx, right? So I want you to think about that, right? We have Manhattan College, it's a PWI, and it's located in the Bronx. And finally, I am a mother to 4 fierce children. one of whom I'm actively parenting on earth, and 3 of whom who have returned to spirit from my womb. And so, I re-articulate, my biographical note because it's intimately relevant to my time on planet Earth and the work my soul charted for me before I arrived in this body named Roxana. Right. And what this all means is that I very deeply think, study, write, and teach about generational woundedness and vulnerabilities of all kinds. And I've been doing this for the past 20 years. Simply put, the work that my soul has chosen to do in this earthly human bodily incarnation of mine is to experience deep-seated grief. And I'd like to repeat this idea, or energy. I'd like to repeat this energy so that you can think about this, right? So one of my soul purposes is to experience deep-seated grief, right? To experience deep-seated grief. It's loss that emanates from my core and radiates through my chest, culminating in irreparable heartbreak from not only the loss of 3 of my babies, but also the BIPOC children who have and continue to die. Or perhaps I should use the word murder, because of state-sanctioned violence, right? So let's just sit in that about sit in the children who are lost. And I'm reminded of Sherry Mitchell's words here. She's an Indigenous American attorney and author of Sacred Instructions. And she talks about this overwhelming grief that many of us experience suddenly, and what feels like for no reason, right? It just comes up, this grief. We have no idea where it's from, what it means. We just feel this grief. And we feel this deep sense of loss and sadness, right? And sharp chest pains. And we're unable to pinpoint the source. And Mitchell talks about interconnectedness here, right? Interconnectedness. We are all interconnected. And so the collective pain that we feel is the pain that shoots from the body of a mother whale as she circles in the water carrying her dead baby, murdered by misguided humans. And as I was listening to Mitchell speak, I immediately felt a chill in my spine. And I was painfully reminded of Richard H. Pratt's founding of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 in Pennsylvania to civilize Indigenous or Indian children, right? So I'm referring to forced removal of Native children from their families, their land, their food, their spiritual practices, right? Their entire way of life and being in the world, right? Their entire way of life and being in the world stripped away from them. And those of you who are familiar with Pratt's the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, you'll know that he delivered a speech in 1892 at George Mason University. And this speech included the infamous line, kill the Indian and save the man, right? So while we may not have directly had these experiences, right? The experience of the mother whale losing her child, the experience of Indigenous folk, Indigenous parents losing their children, not knowing where they are, right? We may not have experienced this grief directly, but we are impacted by it. There's this collective grief that is being charged through our interconnectedness. And so the 17th century poet and samurai Masa Hyde's shattering proverb completely dissolves me as I sit in the loss of my own children and the loss of children in general. And so Masa Hyde writes, barns burnt down. Now I can see the moon. Okay, barns burnt down. Now I can see the moon. So Masa Hyde gives me with insight about what it might mean for us to grieve the loss of people we love. And so from the howling depths of my womb that carry the skeletons of my children, I offer my woundedness and vulnerability to you as a pathway or a mirror to those of you who sit in loss of any kind, whether it's, losing your favorite teddy bear as a 6-year-old, to being sexually assaulted in your college dorm, to losing children. In the work that I do with my students and clients, and in the upcoming workshop, I demonstrate how to piece back together the wandering fragments of our soul from shattering grief, right? To piece back together the wandering fragments of our soul from shattering grief. Simply put, I identify patterns of trauma in our lives, and I carefully thread our woundedness to generational experiences in our family lines. And in the end, I serve to resolve family trauma and recover our lost authenticities so that we can all dare, right? So that we can all dare to show up fully in our lives. And so I'd like to take some time today to both question and operationalize some of the terms, concepts, and ideas I've brought forward thus far, because the language we use and what we mean is important, right? We know that the studies show, research shows, we know that language shapes how we think, and the meanings, right, of the words we use, the meanings inform how we engage with the world we live in, right? So language can either limit our capacity to show up in the world, and at the same time, it could also make our showing up in the world or support us showing up in the world in more expansive ways or inexpansive ways. So before I start thinking about terms with y'all, I'd like to just take like a couple of seconds, a little break. If you could all, for the next minute or so, turn on your cameras, if you're willing to show up in that way, then I would deeply appreciate that. And I'll give you all a second to make a decision about whether you would like to show up on your cameras or not. All right. So here's what I'd like to offer you. So I started off talking about grief and the loss of children. And so for those of us who have lost children, my words can pull on, our heartstrings and our chest, right? They can pull on some of our grief and pain. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you a grace point on your palm. And so if you take your palm and press in the middle where there's a little bit of depth, right? Take your palm and press in the middle. There's a nadi here, which is a chakra, right? It's a chakra point. The body has many, many chakra points, not what we understand as the 7 main chakra points, right? So there's a chakra point here. And so if you take your thumb and you push down on it, right? You push down on it and just rub it gently. This is called, in the Akashic records, this is called the main grace point. And if you push down on it, right, you sit, you push down on it, just close your eyes for a little bit. What this does is it releases contracted energy. It helps to release contracted energy. And the purpose here, right, releasing contracted energy, it's so that we can receive information clearly, more clearly, right? So releasing contracted energy so the information is clearly received, right? So this helps us to focus. It helps us to have insights. It integrates the new insights that we receive, right? It integrates the new insights that we're receiving and helping us to create positive reference points, okay? So again, it's located in the center of the palm. And I'll just repeat it really, really quickly, right? This is a main grace point that was shared by the Lords of the Akashic Records to us humans. And this grace point releases contracted energy so that we can receive information clearly, and that whatever new information we are receiving, right, that it's in our highest good, and that we are able to integrate and create positive new references. So I think it's appropriate that we use this grace point as we continue to listen to my talk today. So I use the words trauma and healing all the freaking time, right? Trauma healing, trauma healing. And I use these words, trauma and healing, as a point of common reference because that's most people understand these words, or at least they think they understand these words. And so as a social inequality scholar, right, while I do use these words, as a social inequality scholar, I'm actually quite uncomfortable with the terms, right? Here's what I'm going to argue. Both words have been folded into popular culture. And quite frankly, these words have become buzzwords. And I'm confident that many of you are familiar with the phrases trauma healing and more so trauma informed. I hear this phrase a lot, trauma informed. And in fact, I perhaps even use them incessantly. And it seems to me, everyone claims to be engaged in trauma-informed work, right? Everyone seems to be engaged in trauma-informed work. And I suspect people do so without completely understanding what being trauma-informed might mean. And so I would argue that the term healing, right, the term healing has been falsely conflated with the neoliberal notion of self-care, right? So I'm just going to repeat this idea, right? To think about this, perhaps the term healing has been falsely conflated with the neoliberal notion of self-care. Right. I think about the incessant eruption of hot yoga studios across the US as a telling example of this. And the term trauma, right, has been falsely conflated, at least I argue, has been falsely conflated with our inability to take complete responsibility, or what I call radical responsibility, for our actions and behaviors and for ourselves. And what I'd like to offer to you today is that I think it's imperative that we step away from the popularized, colonized discourse of trauma healing, right? And what I'm suggesting is that much of what we understand trauma to be or mean is not trauma, but rather we're referring to a trigger, right? Which is an event, right? So trauma versus trigger. And so in my work, I define trauma as an internal response to an overwhelming situation that can't be processed at the time. So this is separate from the event, right? So trauma isn't an event. Rather, it's undigested, uncontained, and postponed energy that lives in our body. So there's a somatic element. And it limits our capacity to live our lives fully. So I'm just going to repeat this idea, right? So I'm articulating that trauma isn't an event. The trigger is connected to an event. And so I'd like us to think about trauma as energy, right? As postponed energy, undigested energy, and it's living in our body. And it limits our capacity to live our lives fully. And so if we understand trauma in this way, right, that there's a deep somatic element, then we can begin to understand that talk therapy may not be completely productive in dislodging the trauma that's sitting in our body. It may not be completely productive to support the containment of the trauma, right? Because the energy is uncontained. And so we're reliving trauma over and over and over again. So in my upcoming workshop, we are going to be thinking about ways in which we can create a container, right? And we will be creating this container through somatic work. So in shamanism, we think about trauma as soul loss, or susto, right? Which literally means scare from Spanish to English. And so, as a decolonial scholar, I specifically define trauma healing to mean something so this is what I mean by trauma healing. It's intentional and deliberate practices that restore indigenous epistemologies as a way to show up and operate in the world. Okay, so we're thinking about trauma as soul loss. This is what I'd like to offer to you, right? To think about trauma as soul loss, to think about it in terms of postponed energy in our body that limits our capacity to live our lives fully. And then when we talk about trauma healing, or when I talk about trauma healing, I'm speaking about intentional and deliberate practices that restore Indigenous epistemologies as a way to show up and operate in the world. Ultimately, what I'm arguing and what I'm offering is I call on a return to what is known as tribal consciousness. And this is what I will be teaching in my upcoming workshop, right? What does tribal consciousness look like? What are the elements of tribal consciousness? And how can we practice and participate in tribal consciousness as a way of life, right? As a way of showing up every day in the world. And so in my upcoming workshop, we'll work together to respond to the question, how might we think about trauma, right? How might we think about trauma? How might we want to, how might we want to be thinking about trauma in the name of decolonizing psychotherapy, right? Because I was talking about, talk therapy, right? So to really think about how can we decolonize psychotherapy, and we'll work somatically to excavate a root cause of our woundedness. And so the other term that I would like for us to think about is trauma resolution. And particularly this word resolution, or the word resolve. And again, I use these words often because it's a point of common reference. But here's what I've observed. I've observed that we as a culture, both nationally in the US and I would argue globally, we've popularized the term trauma resolution also, right? And once again, even though I continue to use these words, trauma, healing, and resolution, I would like to argue that the word resolution is falsely conflated with resilience and recovery, right? So let's just think about that for a second, right? There's a false conflation between resolution and resilience and recovery. And so what I'd like to do in the upcoming workshop is I'd like to flesh out that the Western therapeutic model of resolution does not serve us. Okay, the Western therapeutic model of resolution does not serve us because it renders our vulnerabilities as a source of weakness. So just think about that, right? It renders our vulnerabilities, our grief, our heartbreak, our loss as a source of weakness, right? The language that we use is, how do we resolve heartbreak? How do we resolve our grief? And the assumption there is that our vulnerabilities are a source of weakness. I'd like to argue that a decolonized understanding of trauma resolution is to think about what might bring balance in our lives in the context of grief, right? What might bring balance in our lives in the context of grief? So, as a point of shamanic reference, when a splinter of our soul leaves, right? When a splinter of our soul leaves, right? Because something bad is happening, right? When a splinter of our soul leaves, it does so to protect us at that moment. When a splinter of our soul leaves, right? Something bad is happening. It does so to protect us at the moment, to keep us from harm in a deeper way. And what this means is that the unresponsiveness of our nervous system, right at that moment, the unresponsiveness of our nervous system it's an intelligent design, right? The unresponsiveness of our nervous system is an intelligent design of survival. I mean, nevertheless, right? A part of us, it does become missing, right? A part of us becomes missing as we're experiencing trauma. And in the long run, trauma limits our capacity to engage with ourselves and the world. There's no doubt about that. I'm not challenging that. I'm simply asking that simultaneously, it would behoove us to honor that our body is protecting us when parts of our soul leave, right? It's part of that design of survival. So plainly put, right, I serve the work that I do. I serve to create interactions that are authentically supportive and nourishing. I like these words, supportive and nourishing, so that we can step into the world and offer ourselves without fear, right? I mean, the question that I'm really responding to is, how is it that we're showing up in the world, right? How do we want to show up in the world, right? How is it that we want to show up in the world? How are we showing up in the world? And this is what I mean by living our lives fully. I use this phrase often, living our lives fully. And what I mean by this is developing the capacity, right? Developing. It takes practice. Developing the capacity to show up in our lives and engage with everything, the good, bad, and ugly, with fidelity and integrity. Like I want to repeat this idea, right? Living our lives fully. Living our lives fully takes practice. It requires development. And it's developing a capacity for expansiveness, right? To show up in our lives and engage with the good, bad, and ugly in fidelity and with integrity versus recoiling, right? Recoiling into passivity, right? Moving back, where there's no room to move further into our lives, further and forward and wider, right? So think about this energetically, recoiling, right? You're just becoming smaller versus moving forward, moving wider, moving deeper into one's life, right? Beyond bitterness, beyond anger, beyond resentment, beyond narcissism, right? If you think about the ways in which, bitterness begets anger, anger begets resentment, and resentment begets narcissism, right? So ultimately, in my decolonial therapeutic orientation, I underscore the dominant paradigm of positivist biomedical psychiatry and psychology, that they dismiss indigenous and alternative wisdoms of knowing with a capital K, alternative wisdoms or ways of knowing as unscientific, right, and lacking in empirical evidence, right? This is the normative discourse, right? This is the normative biomedical, psychiatric, and psychology discourse, right? It dismisses indigenous and alternative wisdoms as unscientific and lacking in empirical evidence. But Wabanaki psychiatrist Dr. Louis Mel Madrona, he vehemently challenges this worldview. Dr. Mel Madrona argues that indigenous peoples have been concerned with mental health for thousands of years. Like, sit in that, right? Indigenous folks have been concerned with mental health for thousands of years. And he argues that Indigenous psychology and healing has something to offer to the modern world. And Wabanaki elder Albert Marshall, he argues that humans and our experiences of the world are interdependent and interconnected. So remember the mother whale, right? And how we feel her grief, right? So Albert Marshall argues for this interdependentness, this interconnectedness with the natural and the spiritual worlds. And here's what Marshall and Mel Madrona have done for me, right? As I was studying with them, what they made something, when I was training with them, they made something possible for me, right? So expansion, possibility, expansion. They made it possible for me to not fall into the trap of making the false binary distinction between whatever you want to call it, modern Western science and Indigenous healing epistemologies, right? They're not mutually exclusive. So what I'll teach in the workshop next month is an integrative decolonial knowledge system, right? An integrative decolonial knowledge system that not only supports human survival, but also supports humans to thrive across the lifespan. And I'll accomplish this by integrating sacred knowledges, specifically the Akashic records, which simply put, I'm going to water it down, just boil it down. Simply put, it's an energetic field, right? The Akashic records is an energetic field that's located in the etheric realm, and all events are recorded and imprinted in the Akashic records. And so my hope is that I'll integrate this sacred knowledge of the Akashic records with other modern knowledge systems, specifically inner child therapy. And so Marshall, right, if Albert Marshall were here and listening, he would call this marriage two-eyed seeing. So two-eyed seeing, right, it's something that Albert Marshall created, he coined. It's a way of operating in the world and a way of engaging with our trauma that integrates modern science and Indigenous epistemology. I think it's pretty clear. I think it's clear that what I'm trying to do, or what I have been trying to do for the past 20 years, is to create ethical healing spaces, right? To create ethical healing spaces. And I say this because, I often think about when I gave birth to my firstborn, when I gave birth to my daughter, no one told me that I had an episiotomy. No one told me. And I didn't realize that I had an episiotomy until hours later, and I needed to go to the bathroom. Right. So I think a lot about what unethical healing spaces look like and what it might mean to create ethical healing spaces, right? And so, I work to create ethical healing spaces that are informed by empirical research while operating with a deep humility of not knowing anything. Right, so I'm coming from two spaces that are combined. A space that's data-driven, right, informed by empirical research, which is combined with, I guess I could call it a space of void, like with a capital V, a space of void that I sit in. And this space of void is I know nothing. I know nothing. And so I approach this work that I'm doing with deep humility. So let me take a small break before I wrap up, right? Before I conclude, offer you some concluding lessons that I'd like you to sit in and take away. We're talking about trauma. And I'm articulating that trauma lives in the body. And so if you would like to come on to, yeah, that's a great picture, Riley, love. I will come back to that. You can keep it up if you want, no worries. If you would all like to come back on camera, that's great. And if you don't want to, that's fine too. I'm going to teach you another grace point, right? So I've taught you the main grace point. I want to teach you a second chakra point, which is right here. So you have your pinky here, and then there's this fleshy part. There's another nadi here, a nadi, meaning a chakra point. And so if you grab onto this fleshy part, this is the body release point, right? So you've got the main grace point here for clarity, to receive information, to be open to receiving new information, right? Without judgment, right? This clears you up. This point, the body release point, this releases, right? If you massage it, this releases stuck energy, right? This releases energy that is unmoving, right? So if you listen, if you think about trauma as a sheet of ice, right? It's stuck, it's a block, right? We have to melt the ice. The water needs to flow. And so this point, this body release point, is about releasing stuck energy. And this energy, right? This stuckedness is most definitely about judgments that we have. And I talk a lot about belief systems, right? When I work with my students and clients, and I will be doing this in the workshop too, is getting us to interrogate our belief systems. What do we believe about ourselves? What do we believe about our families, right? So this point releases issues, judgments, beliefs, emotions from the body, right? So this is the body release point. And so when we release, right, when we release issues, judgments, beliefs, and emotions, it allows information to flow, both from us and to us, right? The flow of information becomes available. And when the flow of information becomes available, something magical happens. The cause of our pain is identified, right? So when information flows, something magical happens. We can identify the cause of our pain. And I promise you, the cause of the pain is not because we just had that argument with our partner, or we just had that argument with our mother, or we just had that argument with our child. The cause of the pain is much deeper than that. Those were just trigger events. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in the upcoming workshop. So use these 2 points often. Use it all the time. I'm constantly in meetings. I'm constantly, especially when I'm hearing things I don't like. I'm constantly rubbing this, and I'm like, please forgive me. The judgments that I'm having, help me to hear this information. Help me to understand it. Help me to integrate this information that is coming to me that I don't like. Help me to integrate the parts that are in my highest good, and help me to release what may not be working for me. And so I use these grace points all day long. I use it before I go to bed. I use it when I wake up, just a couple of minutes at night, a couple of minutes in the morning. I promise you, it allows you, it creates space for you. It creates space for you to show up in the world for that day, or maybe it's for the hour, in an expansive way completely. So take it hour by hour, day by day, because I will say something about these grace points. All we have is the present moment. And so we think about our lives, if we think about our lives, right, in the present, if we think about our lives in the present, then we don't have to get stuck, and we think about how we can move forward in a more expansive way. Okay, let me finish up, right? Let me wrap this up for you. So I'd like to wrap up by asserting why we need to do this work. Okay, why do we need to do this work? So beautiful, Riley Love, thank you. So my research shows that our personal experiences with trauma are not individual and insular. And I'm not the only one who's doing this work, right? And there's many decades of research behind me, right? And I will call these researchers my ancestors, right? So there's much research behind me and sitting with me that shows us that our personal experiences with trauma are not individual and insular. And yes, I am not discounting the fact that we have personal experiences, right, that are traumatic, right? When we experience sexual violence, right, it's happening to us. It's in that moment, right? So of course it's personal. And at the same time, I'd like to argue that we can't get stuck in understanding trauma as merely personal. We must embed it in a much larger framework, right? So I'm arguing that trauma is not individual and it's not insular. In fact, our experiences of trauma are embedded with our family systems. And the family constellation theory is very clear about this, right? Our traumas are embedded within our family systems or our family constellation. And our family system is entangled with national histories. And I want to repeat this idea, right? Our experiences of trauma are embedded within our family system or the family constellation. And our family system is most definitely entangled with national histories, right? And what this means, right? Let me explain this a little bit. What this means is that how we show up in the world is unconsciously informed by our family system across generations. And so, for example, right, our maternal grandmother's experience with sexual violence while our mother was in her womb informs how we operate in the world 2 generations later. And the experiences of the family system that are entangled, they are entangled within the larger backdrop of national histories, like the Holocaust, no doubt, 9/11, right? The Great Depression, slavery, the partition of the Indian subcontinent. Riley Love, could you pull up the picture of my paternal grandmother, my dadi? Let me tell you a story tied to what I just argued. So this is my dadi, my paternal grandmother. And I have probably just met her 2 or 3 times, and I was a child. I don't remember her. My Dadi experienced deep-seated marital violence throughout her life. And she experienced deep physical abuse while she was pregnant with my dad. And so some of the work that I did around this, because this experience that didn't happen to me impacted how I was showing up in the world. And so part of the work that I did through shamanic journeying and in working in the Akashic records, and I'll explain this more in my upcoming course. So let me just briefly say this. Through the practice of shamanic journeying, I entered my Dadi's womb while she was pregnant with my dad. And what I experienced in her womb was deep bouts of nausea. Like I was experiencing bouts of nausea. And I realized that my dad, from the beatings of his mother, was experiencing nausea in the womb, feelings of nausea. So fast forward, right, early 1970s, I'm born, Midwest US, right? I'm born. And then almost 30 years later, I'm pregnant with my first child. And my daughter, Raneem, Riley Love, could you bring up Raneem's picture? So that's my Dadi. And let's look at my Raneem's picture. Yeah, if you can find it there. She's 19. My daughter's 19. My daughter was born with cyclical vomiting syndrome. No rhyme or reason, but I see the connection now that she's carrying forward. She's carrying forward my dad's experiences with those bouts of nausea when he was sitting in his mom's womb. I'll share more stories about my family if there's time. Let me talk a little bit, and it's tied to this story. Let me talk a little bit about epigenetics, because the work that I do is informed by epigenetics. And simply put, epigenetics is the study of how our environment can modify our gene expression and cause changes to the ways our genes work across generations. Riley Love, could you bring up the picture with the pregnant, the 3 generations? Perfect. So this picture describes much of Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research. She's a researcher out at Mount Sinai in New York City. And so Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research on the children of Holocaust survivors and pregnant women who survived the 9/11 attacks unveiled genetic changes that stemmed from the trauma. And the changed gene expression was passed on to their children. Specifically, these children who were not directly part of the Holocaust, not directly part of 9/11, these children had higher levels of cortisol and were more prone to depression compared to their counterparts. And I really love this image that Riley Love has up for you, because what I want you to understand here is 3 generations literally living in one body. all at the same time. Right? The egg, right? The egg that's going to become me is already sitting in my mom's body when she's 4 or 5 months old in my grandmother's body, right? So just listen to this. The egg that is going to become me is already present in my mom's body when she's present in her mom's body. Riley, love, do you think you can bring up my maternal, my nani, my maternal, there's my maternal grandmother. Could you also bring up my mom? And that's my mom. So all three of us living in the same body. And so let me share something else with you. So for most of my life, I'm almost 50. For most of my life, I had this deep-seated fear of being homeless, the experience of homelessness. No empirical evidence to support that I would experience homelessness. But my family constellation revealed that my fear of homelessness is tied to the experiences. So I trace my ancestral lineage to the Indian subcontinent, that my fear of homelessness is the experience of partition. And the Indian subcontinent has gone through multiple partitions, the experience of partition that my grandmother had. And then for my mother, right, she was sent to the US when she was 18, 19 for her protection. She had to leave her family behind, right? I didn't have these experiences directly, but I'm carrying these experiences from my grandmother, from my mother, and it impacted the way that I was operating in the world. So these are things that we are going to be uncovering in the workshop. I am seeing that some people are, writing comments or asking questions in the chat. I haven't looked at them yet. We will spend the last 30 minutes exploring what's in the chat box. I'm just going to finish up what I'd like you to know moving forward. So when we think about, Riley Love, could you bring that pregnant picture, the pregnant belly, the 3 generations? Great. So looking at this, here's something that I think is important for us to really sit in. Trauma is collective, and it's often generational. And most of the time, we unknowingly take on energies that are not ours as a way to unconsciously exhibit loyalty or love to our family. This is from family constellation theory. It's not mine. I want you to sit in this. Trauma is collective. It's generational. And oftentimes, a lot of what we feel, a lot of what we do, like our actions, right? Sometimes we take actions and we have no fucking clue why we're doing them. We're just doing it. So oftentimes we are carrying the energies that belong to someone else in our family. And we carry these energies out of love, out of loyalty. And most of the time it's unconscious. And to bring this point around, you all saw my nani, my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother lost two babies. Her first children were twins, two boys, and they didn't make it past the first year. And then they had my mom. My mom is considered to be the eldest, but she's not. She's actually the third child because the twins passed away. My uncles, my mamas, they passed away before they reached the age of 1. So what happened to my mom? When my mom was pregnant with me, I was a twin. And my twin passed away. And then with me, I expressed that same loyalty and same love by losing 3 of my children. And so this is how trauma is collective and generational. There's a loyalty and love there that we will unpack in my upcoming course. And so I understand collective trauma to mean a shared, right? So I shared this story with you, right? So let me give you a definition, right? I understand collective trauma to mean a shared social, psychological, and cultural dimension of pain, grief, hurt, scare, heartbreak, and horror imprinted in the world. I like this word a lot, imprinted. Remember, language matters. Imprinted into the world we are born into. Okay, so I understand collective trauma to mean a shared social, psychological, and cultural dimension of pain, grief, hurt, scare, heartbreak, and horror imprinted into the world we are born into. And remember, the Akashic records, everything is recorded. So the stories of mothers losing children are recorded. And it is through this recording we're experiencing massive group susto, or soul loss. This is why it behooves us to operate within an integrative knowledge system, right? A single wounded generation. I like the word wounded too, more than trauma. I use trauma a lot, but I like the word wounded, right? So a single wounded generation, healed or liberated, impacts 7 generations forward, our descendants, and backward, our ancestors, right? So 7 generations equal 840 years. And so as I'm doing this work, right, as I'm uncovering my family history, as I'm beginning to see how I'm replicating patterns of loss of children, right, feelings of homelessness, as this is becoming illuminated for me, right? Because remember, the purpose of light is to illuminate darkness, right? The purpose of light is to illuminate darkness. I want us to sit in that. The purpose of light is to illuminate darkness. And so as things are being illuminated for me, it allows me to develop a wider vision of what's happening. And perhaps then it helps me to move forward in more expansive ways. And so when I do this work, illuminate for my family, then the ancestors are happy because they don't want me to suffer. And I make changes for my daughter, my only living child, who's now 19. I said that before. I make changes for her. For many years, my daughter exhibited anxiety, and I didn't see a reason for her to have anxiety, but she was carrying my anxiety, my anxiousness of the fear of experiencing homelessness, the fear of losing another child, right? She's carrying this. So as I do this work, her anxiety dissipates. Imagine if you situate everything to you, right? That's all I'm asking. You do the work for you. Then you get to expand 840 years of your family. I think that's a big deal. So, I'm inviting you to join me in this online workshop next month. I'm inviting you to do this sacred work of embodied liberation, right? It's the sacred work of embodied liberation and human transformation. It's 4 Saturdays, right? Next month. It begins June 14th. Riley Love later on today, later in the day, she will email registration information with the cost of the program and with an early bird special. And then of course, when you register, I'll gift you my upcoming publication entitled Bones of the Womb, which is being published by Cambridge University Press. And I do this as a way to honor our tribal children who are no longer with us on Earth. That's exactly why I entitled this publication Bones of the Womb. See, we need to do this work. We need to do this work in order to support opportunities for our youth. And it's irrelevant whether we have children or not, right? That's not the point. We need to do this work to support opportunities for our youth versus compromising them, which is what I think we often do. I think we compromise our youth. And so I'm asking for us to do this work to support opportunities for our youth versus compromising them. And also leaving the world a better place that spans 1,680 years, right? Because remember, I was arguing 7 generations back and 7 generations forward, right? So one set of 7 generations equals 840 years. So you have to multiply that by 2. So this work is about creating expansion. This work is about creating expansion for 1,680 years. And I'll end today by sharing my dad unexpectedly passed away 2 years ago, and I didn't get to say goodbye to him. Riley Love, do you have that picture of me and my dad? So that's my dad, that's me. We're vacationing in Florida there. And I'd like to share what we have on his tombstone as a way to wrap up or end this talk. We belong to God. Riley Love, do you have the saying for my dad's tombstone? Okay. We belong to God, and to them we shall return. We belong to God, and to them we shall return. And that's all I've got for now. I'll turn over the remainder of the session to Riley Love. And once again, if you're attending this talk without registration, then please drop your email in the chat box to Riley Love, or you can also email us at liberation@drrockbad.com. Thank you so much for being patient with me, for making space and room for me to expand myself through this talk. So thank you. Riley Love.
Thank you, Dr. B. It's always a blessing and an honor to receive the wisdom and the knowledge that you channel. It is truly a divine wisdom and a sacred knowledge. So thank you for sharing all of that with us today.
Of course, I know there are questions, but I also saw, I mean, I know there's some of you who have worked with me before. I think I saw Chris here. I would love for you all to like talk about like what this work has done for you, or what it has, you know, meant for you. Riley, do you want to share? And Chris, I know you're here, but I can't see you anymore.
I'm right here still.
Oh, there you are, Chris. Yeah. Riley, do you want to actually, I'll go to Chris first, and then I'll come back to you. Chris and Susie, thank you so much for being here. I see you now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Folks, Susie is she is a freaking amazing family constellation therapist and scholar. She was trained by Bert Hellinger. I am completely freaking in love with her. So I love her work. Thank you for being here. Chris.
Yeah, so, excuse me. I guess I'll just start by saying, you know, this whole realm is very, very new to me. And it's also way out of my wheelhouse. So I'll apologize in advance for butchering verbiage. So
I'll say this to everyone. Chris is my financial advisor.
Thank you, Dr. B. Yeah, so I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Badruddoja over the last 2 years professionally as a advisor, and sometime last year, she had the intuition that I needed help, and I'm not the type of person that asks for help, although the solicitation was 100% needed and appreciated. And I want to say that with some of the personal issues that I was going through, I mean, I can't even, express words and how appreciative I am with the help that she's been able to provide me, not only me, but also my family as well, through association. So, definitely someone who, you want to learn from. I'm so happy that I tuned in today to hear this whole presentation, because it was, very eye-opening, stuff that I never think of. So, definitely somebody who you want to learn from for sure. And she's helped me immensely, and I can't even thank her enough for it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Riley, do you want to share?
Yeah, I'll briefly share, and then I want us to focus on the questions in the chat box. But
Absolutely.
I'd be echoing what Chris said. Dr. Badruddoja's intuition has amazed me, has wowed me, and really inspired me to do this work and to learn as much as I can, because it is possible that we have the power to do this healing for ourselves. And as we've talked about, this ripples through our whole family, our chosen families as well. So I just really encourage everybody to take the time to learn more about this and to take advantage of this workshop. You're not going to want to miss this. It's amazing content and amazing information that once you learn it, you will never be the same in the best ways possible. I've grown so much, and it's all due to this divine sacred knowledge from Dr. B. But I'd like to focus on the chat box now.
Let's focus. I'm actually looking at some of the questions right now. I will say this, because I didn't make this clear. One of the things that I'm going to teach you is how to access your personal Akashic records and to have information flow to you for you, right? To trust that information with fidelity and to receive information clearly. One of the reasons that I wanted to teach you the main grace point is so that you can become an open channel and receive information, right? In shamanism, it's called a hollow bone, right? So this grace point helps you create a hollow bone within yourself so that you can receive the information. And so I will teach you how to open your own personal Akashic records and bring forward information for yourself. So, okay. So is the workshop for professionals, or and this workshop is for everyone? And yes, I understand what you mean by healing. I do use this word, but I don't subscribe to it. So this workshop is how we can tap into our grief and how we can honor our grief and use our grief as a space of expansion, right? So if we can sit in our grief, then we can also expand. But if we don't sit in our grief, it limits our mobility. So I hope, Nadine, are you where are you? Does that help? I don't know where you are. If you want to, oh, there you are, Nadine. Okay, I see you now. Does that help? Yeah, it's for everyone. This workshop is about exploring our woundedness and exploring our woundedness with divine support and guidance. I will, in response, this is partly in response to Nadine's question. Up until 2 days ago, I didn't know what I was going to talk about today. And for the first couple of days, I was freaking out. I was like, what the fuck am I going to say? And then I'm like, calm down. The information is going to come to you. And 48 hours ago, the information just started coming out from my records, what you all needed to hear. Right? So the information that came through is based on who was going to show up today. And the record keepers showed me what you all needed to hear. So it's for everyone. Imagine operating like this in a boardroom or like in some kind of meeting in, at a university setting where you're totally like, okay, this is crap. Imagine sitting with your record keepers. It's a game changer. Honestly, I'm going to say this. Operating from within the Akashic records makes life orgasmic. It allows us to engage with our grief with fidelity, and it allows us to engage with our joy orgasmically, if that makes sense, right? All right, there's tons more questions. Let's see what's going on. Deborah, is there any thought to the pregnancies and births from the collective energy of the pandemic? Can you, Deborah, I don't know where you are, but can you explain this question a little bit? I'm not sure I know what you're asking.
You referred to trauma from generations ago about the Holocaust, or trauma from, I just blanked on the other example you gave. So I was just curious if we've already begun to explore what's happened in the recent 2 years of this pandemic to pregnancies and births.
Yeah, I am going to argue no, that we haven't, right? I think that we are very much still sitting in that frozen energy, right? And many folks argue, that the pandemic has traumatized them. And I would actually, and of course, challenge me if you feel like it, Deborah, I would argue that the pandemic is not a trauma. I would argue that the pandemic serves as an event that triggers something that we have been sitting in since childhood and maybe even further. Does that make sense?
Almost. I'm feeling what you're saying all the way up until the point of the trigger. Can you just describe that just a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the pandemic as an event, right? So I see the pandemic as an event. And some of what we've experienced during the pandemic, like, for example, isolation, children passing
Fear.
away, folks passing away, fear. Yes, perfect. Like fear, scare, right? Isolation, right? So the pandemic is a trigger that has brought all of this up in us, and all of this stuff that's coming out belongs much further back.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
And
Okay.
I don't think, right, we've been in the pandemic for right now for 2 years. I don't think we have yet made the decision to work to contend with the pandemic. So I suppose now that I'm rereading your question, the quick answer is no. I don't think we've done that yet.
Mhm.
But you
That was a
brought
great
it
answer.
up. Right, but you've brought it up, Deborah. So see, all of this is being recorded by the lords of the Akashic records. So you've brought this up. So maybe by asking this question, you're creating an imprint of how we need to move forward with our grief that's tied to the pandemic, particularly the pregnancies and births that you're talking about.
Mhm.
Yes?
Yeah. Yeah. That was good. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Oh, Deborah, do future generations affect us from the
Yeah.
other? Oh, okay. Explain that, please.
I don't have as many of the stories. I don't have as many of the identified traumas. I think my roots, people just shut down and I don't know. I don't know if anything happened to my grandmother or my mother. No one talks about it. But I know more about what's happening to my own children and my grandchildren. So does the energy flow two different directions, or are you really looking at what's happened before in terms of Akashic?
Right. No, so the energy, okay, that's actually a beautiful, now that I understand what you're asking, beautiful, brilliant question. And so the energy flow is not linear, and it's also not unidirectional, right? So the energy is flowing in multiple directions and simultaneously. And I love that you said you don't know much about your ancestors. I knew nothing. I knew
Oh,
nothing.
got it.
So, my mom, immigrated to the United States in her late teen years. My dad, the same thing. And I had no connection. I mean, I was born and raised in the Midwest, had no connection, did not know anything. And through family constellations and the Akashic records, I was able to energetically connect to my ancestors and learn more. And then I started asking questions to my mom, like these pictures that Riley Love, she was showing. These are all pictures that I recently, like maybe like a couple of years, I'm like, hey mom, tell me more about your mom. Tell me I didn't know who my ancestors were, but you don't need to know. You can energetically connect with them in the Akashic records. And my family constellations revealed that reproductive grief, right? Revealed the grief of ethnic genocide, because I didn't experience ethnic genocide, but my ancestors did. Right? And so, no, you don't need to know your ancestors to do this work. This work will your ancestors will step forward. Trust me, they're waiting for all of us to show up. I know that for a fact. They're waiting for us to show up. And our children can also help us. I don't like the word heal, but I'm going to use it because it's easy to use. Our children can also help us to heal. So the energy is also flowing from them. One thing that I will talk about, and I won't talk about in depth here because actually I'm over time and I know folks need to go, but children have a deep sense. Bert Hellinger from Family Constellations calls this the magical love of children. Children will show us unconscious loyalty, right? And they do this by limiting their lives because they show a type of patriotism, if you want to call it, towards their parents, right? And so the energy flows in multiple directions. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? You don't have to type in the chat box. I know we're over time, so you are absolutely, welcome to leave if you need to. And Riley Love will send out from Cassandra. Hold on. Of course. Okay, Cassandra, of course. Riley Love is going to send out some information later in the day. If you have further questions, I'm happy to hang out a little bit more.
We do have one more question in the
Okay.
chat box from Linda.
I missed it. Where is it?
I think it's the one of the last 4 messages.
Yes, I see it. Okay, this is a beautiful question. The quick and where are you, Linda? Let me see if I can scroll down and find you.
Linda's here.
Hey, yes, I see you. Hi, Linda. The quick answer is yes. And so there's a lot of work that I do. So I work with a lot of families who, and I know this is not similar, but it's tied. I work with a lot of families who have children that they've adopted, right? And so similarly with the carrier, the surrogate, absolutely there's a connection there that we carry through. And so those would also need to be, I'm using the word resolved, but those energies would also need to be balanced in the family constellation. Is there something more that you would like to know beyond the question? Absolutely, yes.
And if there's any questions that anybody didn't feel comfortable asking in front of the group or through the chat, our email box is wide open for any questions, comments, inspirations. It's a liberation at drrockbad.com. It's in the chat box if anybody needs it.
Okay, and Linda, I'm now reading your question more closely. So now I understand cultural lineage to my child, though the child is genetically mine. Yeah, the womb. I just want to I want to say a little bit more about this. So the womb that we are living in, right, most definitely impacts, how it impacts what we're imprinted with. So the answer is yes to that too. Is there anything else that you would like to ask, Linda, beyond that, or even more specific? Or
Yeah, it's just there's a lot going on. My dad passed February 25th from terminal cancer. My mom currently has terminal cancer as well. She's had it for 4.5 years, and there is great difficulty because she's just a completely wounded soul, and I mean broken beyond repair. And she hasn't managed to find a way out, even in 69 years on this earth. And I think energetically, from a family constellation point of view, I think she used me energetically to try to save herself. It wasn't intentional. She wasn't trying to kill me, but energetically, it was almost like if she could just save herself, she wasn't going to look at the consequences.
yeah.
And
Yes.
so there's a huge dichotomy between my conscious self, right, and my life, and looking at it just in this dimension within this lifetime. And there's a sense of, oh, that sucks. How did I get stuck with these parents? And then there's another level of they're just broken souls. And because of my, divine contract and other reasons, vows I've made, I chose them as parents.
Yes.
And so I'm just trying to find some level of resolution because my husband and I are looking for surrogates, going through that process. And I'm just not, I don't, and I know for me it's been an emotional obstacle. I mean, doctors say it's physical and I have endometriosis, but I simply don't believe it. It's completely emotional. And on the secular level, it's the fact that I don't want to be the type of mother she was, even though she loves me, it was completely toxic. And I don't want to inadvertently be her. And on a energetic level, it's the sense that there's a lot of generational trauma from her that's unhealed. And whether even if I'm aware of it consciously, I'll still pass it on to my kids because it's on an energetic level that I won't be able to control with my words or actions. So there is a real sense of, I guess, I don't know, a real sense that, I've thrown everything at it: family constellation, shamanism,
Yeah.
inner child work, inner family, system stuff, just you name it, I've thrown at it. And
Yeah.
it just feels like I don't know what to do anymore because I've really thrown everything in the kitchen sink at it. And that's after, decades of talk therapy. So
Right, right. And so, Linda, is there a question? I mean, there's lots of
I
things.
mean, the
I'm thinking
question
about. Is there
is,
a question?
yeah, the question is, in what way would your workshop, in what way, on what level would it be addressed? Because a lot of the knowledge part, like your hypothesis and so forth, I've heard it in other contexts, spoken in other spiritual disciplines. And
Mhm.
so most of it I've heard, and I don't need to be convinced. I
Mhm.
think I'm just looking for tools, a pathway and guidance
Yeah.
to walk that path in a way that feels energetically good. And
Mhm.
so I don't know whether that is what it will be.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, and that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked. So, in this workshop, I'm going to be combining family constellation with the Akashic records. So, while I am a traditional family constellation therapist, right? I've been trained in, the theories of Bert Hellinger. I combine the dynamics of the family, and I infuse that within the Akashic records. And so part of what makes my work different is that I think about not necessarily resolving what's happening, right? So the idea is, for example, children who need to take care of their mothers, right? Or they've chosen to take care of their mothers, which from what I think, from what you've said, I think you already know, in family constellation, that's understood as parentification, right? And so the idea is not to be like, okay, mom, I'm not going to take care of you anymore because I need to go live my life, but rather to understand with guidance, like from the Akashic records, right? From your personal Lord of the Akashic records, to receive guidance about what are some of the ways that you can engage in this responsibility of taking care of your parent, but also nurturing, right? Nurturing the inner child that's in you, right? So I'll do inner child therapy with you all. Nurturing the inner child in you to allow you to move forward in a more expansive way while still being committed to maybe some of the responsibilities that you've taken on for yourself. So I think I also want to put out here is, when you're sitting in the Akashic records, you are channeling information and things become a lot more clearer. It doesn't mean that we are not going to be unhappy. It doesn't mean that we're going to not be unhappy. It doesn't mean that we are not going to experience pain. It doesn't mean that there are not going to be moments in our life that totally freaking suck. That's not the point. The point is that when this horror comes up for us, and horror will come, grief will come, pain will come, and it'll continue to come. The question really is how do I get to show up this time around? How do I get to operate this time around? So that's the difference. I think this is really important for me to say. It really doesn't matter what we do, right? Because I often get questions like, oh, should I leave my partner or should I not leave my partner, or this and that, right? It doesn't matter. what we do. What we need to think about is why we're doing what we're doing, right? So there's two things that I've learned in the Akashic records. This is one of them. It doesn't matter, right? This is a life lesson. It doesn't matter what we do or not do. What matters is why we're doing what we're doing or why we're not doing what we're doing, right? That's one of the lessons that I've learned. And here's the second lesson that I've learned, which is antithetical to, because Linda, you talked about, talk therapy, right? Which is antithetical to to Western, psychotherapy. Our relationships do not need to be healed, right? This idea of, my relationship with my mom is broken. My relationship with my spouse is broken, broken relationships. This is a Western ideology. And so our relationships do not need to be healed. Rather, whatever our relationships are, those relationships have come into our life so that we can engage in our own healing. So it's not about healing the relationship. Relationships just are. This is a huge lesson. Relationships just are. What these relationships.
I've definitely arrived at that conclusion after, at least certainly with my parents. So
Sure.
I think it's just, in my experience, it takes a lot of cleansing, energy and soul level for me to get to a place where I can do journeys properly or be able to interact with spirits or things in the soul world properly. And so I assume it's the same with Akashic records. Will the workshop be theory or be more the technical aspect of how to move through the energy world, essentially?
So a large part of the course is theoretical, which is combined with the practical engagement with the theory. So it's both.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Of course. All right. We are way past time. I'm happy to hang out for 5 more minutes if you like. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all next month. Are there any other questions? Of course, Tessa. Of course. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you. Deborah. Yes, you're welcome. Lalit, thanks for coming. Riley, love, I think we can stop recording.